You know that saying about how you never really know someone until you divorce them? Well, I'd argue you start seeing their true colors long before the papers are signed. For me, it was on a random Tuesday in March when I discovered my husband of 12 years was sleeping with his assistant. God, it sounds so cliché when I say it out loud, like something straight out of a bad Lifetime movie. But there I was, living that cliché. My name is Olivia Carter. At the time, I was 38, working as a senior financial analyst at Sterling & Grant, a top-tier investment firm in Chicago. I specialized in risk assessment and asset protection, skills that would end up saving me in ways I never anticipated when I chose this career path. Ethan and I met in grad school. He was studying corporate law while I was getting my MBA in finance. We were the power couple everyone envied, both ambitious, both driven. When he landed a partnership at Wellington & Shaw, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, we celebrated for days. I was genuinely proud of him. That's the thing that still hurts sometimes. I really did love him deeply. The day I found out about Rachel, I wasn't even looking for anything. That's how these things usually happen, right? I'd stopped by Ethan's office to surprise him with lunch, something I rarely did because we were both so busy. The receptionist said he was in a meeting but would be done soon, so I decided to wait in his office. His computer was open, unusual for Ethan, who was always paranoid about client confidentiality. A message notification popped up from RW. It read, "Still thinking about last night. Can't wait for our weekend away. I bought something special to wear. Or not wear." I just sat there, my hands shaking so badly I had to set down the lunch bag before I dropped it. Then more messages came in, each one more explicit than the last. I shouldn't have kept reading, but it was like watching a car crash in slow motion. RW. Rachel Whitmore. His 28-year-old assistant with the perfect highlights and legs that went on forever. The one he'd insisted on hiring personally. The one he'd been working late nights with for the past 6 months. "Liv, what are you doing here?" I jumped at Ethan's voice. He stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to alarm as he noticed his computer screen. "I brought lunch," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "But it seems you've been having quite the feast already." His face did this thing, this transformation. One second, he was my husband of 12 years, the next, he was a complete stranger. His eyes hardened, his jaw tightened. "You shouldn't snoop through my private messages," he said coldly. Can you believe that? That was his response, not denial, not apology, just accusation. "They popped up while I was waiting for you," I said. "How long, Ethan?" He sighed, loosening his tie. "Look, Liv, these things happen. People grow apart. We've both been so busy with our careers. Don't you dare put this on me," I snapped, finding my voice. "How long?" 8 months, he finally admitted. "But it doesn't have to be a big deal. We can work through this." I made a mistake. 8 months. Almost 250 days of lies. All those business trips, all those late meetings, all those weekends when he was supposedly catching up on casework. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked toward the door with as much dignity as I could muster. When I reached him, I paused. "We'll talk about this at home," I said as I brushed past him. He grabbed my arm, not hard, but firmly enough to stop me. "Liv, be smart about this," he said quietly. "Remember our prenup. Remember whose name is on most of our assets. Don't make this ugly." In that moment, with those words, something crystallized inside me. This wasn't just about the affair. This was about who Ethan truly was. Someone who would leverage financial power as a threat before the confrontation had even really begun. "I'm always smart, Ethan," I replied, pulling my arm free. "That's what you used to love about me. Remember?" I walked out of his office, past Rachel's desk, where she sat pretending to be engrossed in paperwork, her cheeks flushed pink. Our eyes met briefly. She knew that I knew. And for just a flicker of a moment, I saw something like guilt cross her face before she looked away. I made it all the way to my car before I broke down. I sat there in the parking garage, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, and sobbed until I could barely breathe. 12 years. 12 years of building a life with someone who could throw it all away and then immediately threaten me. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. Once you're there, the only way to go is up. And as I sat in that car, watching my mascara run in the rearview mirror, a small, cold voice in the back of my head started whispering. A voice that sounded a lot like the financial analyst I was in the boardroom. Assets, liabilities, risk assessment, contingency planning. I drove home, packed an overnight bag, and checked into a hotel. I needed space to think, to plan. Because if there's one thing I've learned in my career, it's that emotions are the enemy of sound financial decisions. And what was divorce, after all, but the dissolution of a financial partnership? That night, in a sterile hotel room with a view of downtown Chicago, I didn't call my friends. I didn't call my family. Instead, I opened my laptop and began making a list. A comprehensive inventory of our life together. Our assets, our debts, our accounts. And as I worked through the numbers, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Over the past year, Ethan had been moving money around. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. Consulting fees paid to shell companies I'd never heard of. Investment accounts I didn't have access to. He hadn't just been planning an affair, he'd been planning an exit. The next morning, I went back home before Ethan would be awake. He hadn't come home the night before. No prizes for guessing where he'd spent the night. I needed access to his home office, to our financial documents. I also needed him to believe I was falling apart, not plotting. When he finally came home around midday, I was sitting at the kitchen island, looking appropriately devastated, which, to be fair, wasn't hard to pull off. I was devastated, just not paralyzed. Liv, he sighed, setting his keys down. We need to talk. About Rachel? Or about the money you've been hiding? I asked quietly. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? I'm a financial analyst, Ethan. Did you really think I wouldn't notice $430,000 disappearing over 18 months? He recovered quickly, I'll give him that. The momentary surprise was replaced with practiced confidence, the kind I'd seen him use in courtrooms. Those are legitimate business investments, he said smoothly. And frankly, they're none of your concern. My finances are my business. Your finances are my finances, I reminded him. We're married, remember? He laughed, actually laughed, and walked to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a generous amount of whiskey. The prenup you signed says differently. And considering the circumstances, I think it's time we discuss separation terms. We signed that prenup 13 years ago when neither of us had anything, I said. Not legally, he replied, taking a slow sip of his drink. Courts uphold prenups like ours all the time. Face it, Liv, you walked into this with your eyes open. I had. When we married, I'd been a starry-eyed 26-year-old who believed in forever. The prenup had seemed reasonable then, a formality that would never come into play because we'd never separate. God, I was naive. So that's it? I asked. 12 years together, and you're just done? Ethan leaned against the counter, studying me over the rim of his glass. Look, I'm not a monster. I'll make sure you're taken care of. The condo in Lincoln Park, you can have that. A reasonable alimony for a year or two while you get on your feet. But the house, the vacation property, my investments, those stay with me. And Rachel, I couldn't help asking, does she move in here once I'm gone? Something flickered across his face, annoyance, maybe a touch of guilt. Rachel is complicated, he said carefully. But yes, we have plans. I see, I said. And I really did. All the pieces were falling into place. And how long have you had these plans? He shrugged, clearly growing impatient with my questions. Does it matter? The point is, our marriage is over. I've already spoken with Daniel Mercer. Daniel was his friend and colleague who specialized in divorce law. He'll be handling my side of things. I suggest you find representation quickly. You've already lawyered up, I said, unable to keep the hurt from my voice. This was moving faster than even I had anticipated. It's just business, Liv. You of all people should understand that. Just business. 12 years of marriage, reduced to a transaction. I felt something inside me harden, like molten metal being tempered in cold water. That night, Ethan slept in the guest room. I lay awake in our bed, soon to be just his bed, and stared at the ceiling, listening to him make a late-night phone call. I didn't need to hear the words to know he was talking to her. The next morning over coffee, he outlined his proposed settlement. It was insulting. The Lincoln Park condo, which we'd bought as an investment property, was underwater, worth less than we owed on it. The generous alimony would barely cover my basic expenses for a year. Meanwhile, he would keep our 4,000 square foot home in Evanston, the lake house in Michigan, his retirement accounts, and all our joint investment portfolios. This is ridiculous, I said, pushing the papers back across the table. Half of what we've built is mine. Not according to the prenup, he replied calmly. And not according to how the assets are titled. Be reasonable, Liv. Fight me on this, and you'll end up with even less. I stared at my husband, this stranger wearing Ethan's face, and realized something important. He thought I was stupid. Or, more accurately, he thought I was financially naive. In our marriage, he had handled the legal matters, and I had trusted him with that. What he didn't seem to remember was that I spent my days analyzing financial vulnerabilities and protecting assets for multi-million-dollar corporations. I need time to think, I said, making my voice small. This is all happening so fast. He nodded, clearly pleased with my apparent submission. Take the weekend, but I need an answer by Monday. I'd like to get this wrapped up quickly and cleanly. I'm sure you would, I thought. That afternoon, while Ethan was at the gym, or, more likely, with Rachel, I made 2 important phone calls. The first was to Sophia Reynolds, the best divorce attorney in Illinois and a woman I'd met through a financial summit 3 years earlier. The second was to my boss, explaining that I needed to take 2 weeks of emergency personal leave. Something Ethan had said kept echoing in my mind. Fight me on this, and you'll end up with even less. I had no intention of fighting him, at least, not in the way he expected. No, I was going to do something far more effective. I was going to listen to that cold, analytical voice in my head, the one that specialized in risk assessment and asset protection. The one that was already forming a plan. The next 2 weeks were the most intensely focused period of my life. While Ethan thought I was falling apart, something I encouraged by appearing teary and distracted whenever he was home, I was actually working methodically through a comprehensive strategy. Sophia, my attorney, was worth every penny of her $800 hourly rate. During our first meeting, I laid out everything I knew. The affair, the hidden money transfers, the prenup I'd signed when I was young and trusting. The prenup is potentially challengeable, she said, reviewing the document. Especially if we can prove he was already moving assets in anticipation of divorce. That shows bad faith. But challenges take time, and they're not guaranteed. What if I told you there might be more to this than just hidden marital assets? I asked carefully. Sophia's eyebrows rose. I'm listening. In the process of tracking Ethan's financial movements, I found some irregularities. Payments to entities that don't seem to exist. Cash withdrawals that don't make sense. And a pattern of billing clients for hours that don't align with his calendar. This wasn't entirely true, not yet. But I had suspicions, and I needed to know if Sophia would help me if those suspicions proved correct. Olivia, Sophia said carefully, are you suggesting your husband might be engaging in financial impropriety at his firm? I'm suggesting that if such evidence existed, it would change the dynamics of our divorce negotiations. Sophia studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. If, hypothetically, you discovered evidence of billing fraud or tax evasion during a legitimate search for marital assets, that would create significant leverage. But, she added, raising a cautionary finger, if you go looking for such evidence specifically or access areas you're not authorized to access, that could backfire spectacularly. I understood perfectly. Sophia was giving me the legal boundaries while acknowledging the potential strategy. I needed to be careful, meticulous, and above all, legal in my information gathering. And so began Operation Phoenix. That's actually what I called it in my notes. Pathetic, I know, but it gave me focus when I felt like my world was collapsing. The first step was securing my own financial position. I had a separate bank account that Ethan didn't know about, not because I'd been hiding money, but because it was an old account I'd never closed from before our marriage. I transferred my next 3 paychecks directly to that account. Next, I began documenting everything in our home. Taking photos of valuable items, creating spreadsheets of purchase prices and current values. The art collection Ethan was so proud of. The wine cellar worth nearly $100,000. The watches, the furniture, everything. The most challenging part was accessing Ethan's financial records without raising suspicions. Fortunately, years of sharing a life had given me certain advantages. I knew his patterns, his passwords, or at least the variations he used. And most importantly, I knew when he would be out of the house. While he thought I was at yoga classes or therapy appointments, both covers for my meetings with Sophia, I was actually combing through years of financial statements, tax returns, and his home office files. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions and gave me the leverage I desperately needed. Ethan hadn't just been hiding marital assets, he'd been systematically committing tax fraud and billing fraud for years. He had been double billing clients, declaring personal expenses as business deductions, and had created a complex shell structure to hide income from the IRS. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ethan specialized in corporate law, including compliance issues. He'd used his expertise to skirt the very laws he advised clients on. I documented everything meticulously, making copies and storing them in a secure cloud account only I could access. Sophia reviewed my findings and confirmed what I already suspected. This was enough to not only invalidate our prenup but potentially end Ethan's legal career if it became public. But I still needed one more piece to complete my plan. I needed to catch him and Rachel together, to have irrefutable proof of the affair that even Ethan couldn't smooth-talk his way out of. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 weeks after discovering the affair, Ethan announced he was going to New York for a legal conference from Thursday to Sunday. A quick check of the American Bar Association calendar showed no such conference. "That's fine," I said mildly over dinner. "I might go visit my sister in Boston while you're gone." "Good idea," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "Getting away might help clear your head about the settlement." I nodded, playing the role of the gradually accepting soon-to-be ex-wife. "Maybe you're right." Thursday morning, I pretended to leave for the airport, even taking a lift with my suitcase. What Ethan didn't know was that I had the Lyft drop me at a rental car location, where I picked up a nondescript sedan. I then drove to a hotel room I'd booked near our house and waited. Around 2 p.m., I drove past our house. Ethan's car was gone, as expected. He'd told me his flight was at 11 a.m. But what I hadn't expected was to see a familiar red BMW in our driveway. Rachel's car. They weren't even waiting until he was supposed to be out of town. They were meeting at our house, in our bed, while I was supposedly flying to Boston. I parked down the street and waited, my heart pounding. This was it, the final piece I needed. After an hour, I walked up to my own front door and used my key to enter quietly. The sounds coming from upstairs left no doubt about what was happening. I took a deep breath, steadied my shaking hands, and walked up the stairs. What happened next played out like a scene from a bad movie. I pushed open the bedroom door. Rachel screamed. Ethan swore. Clothes were grabbed. Accusations were thrown. I stood calmly in the doorway, my phone recording the entire confrontation. "Olivia, what the hell?" Ethan shouted, pulling on his pants. "You're supposed to be on your way to Boston. And you're supposed to be on your way to New York," I replied evenly. Interesting how neither of us is where we claimed we'd be. Rachel was frantically gathering her clothes, her face crimson with embarrassment, or anger, probably both. "This isn't what it looks like," Ethan tried, falling back on the oldest cliché in the book. I actually laughed. "It's exactly what it looks like, Ethan. You and your assistant in our marital bed on a Thursday afternoon when we're both supposed to be out of town. You were spying on me," he accused, his lawyer brain already shifting to counterattack. "I came home because I forgot something," I lied smoothly. "But I'm actually glad this happened. Now everything's out in the open." Rachel, now partially dressed, tried to slip past me to the door. I stepped aside to let her pass, but not before saying, "He told me you've been together for 8 months. Just so you know what you're getting into." The look of confusion on her face confirmed another suspicion of mine. Ethan had been lying to her, too, about how long they'd been involved. When we were alone, Ethan's demeanor changed completely. Gone was the embarrassed adulterer, replaced by the cold, calculating attorney I'd come to know these past weeks. "This changes nothing about our settlement," he said, buttoning his shirt. "If anything, your little ambush today just confirmed we need to end this quickly." "I agree," I said, surprising him. "Let's end this quickly. I'll sign your settlement offer on one condition." He looked suspicious but intrigued. "What condition?" "I want to be the one to tell the partners at your firm about your creative billing practices and your elaborate tax evasion scheme." The color drained from his face. For several seconds, he said nothing, just stared at me as the implications of my words sank in. "You're bluffing," he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Client number 7294, Tech Vantage Solutions," I recited from memory. "Billed for 44 hours in March when you were actually in Miami with me." "The Harrington Trust, billed for document review on Christmas Day last year." "The offshore account in the Bahamas under the name Carter Consulting Group, where you funneled over $800,000 in unreported income." Should I continue? He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, our bed, where minutes earlier he'd been with another woman. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, feeling the power shift in the room. "Everything, Ethan. I want everything." That night, Ethan slept in the guest room again, but this time, not by choice. I could hear him pacing, making phone calls in hushed tones, probably trying to figure out how much I really knew and what his options were. I didn't sleep either. I was too wired, too aware that I was standing at a precipice. The next 24 hours would determine whether my plan succeeded or failed spectacularly. Friday morning, I was in the kitchen when Ethan appeared, looking haggard and beaten. He poured himself coffee and sat across from me at the island. "I've been thinking about your concerns," he said carefully. "I'm prepared to offer a more equitable settlement." "I'm listening," I replied, keeping my expression neutral. "Full ownership of the Lincoln Park condo, with all mortgage obligations transferred to me. Half of our liquid assets. A lump sum alimony payment of $300,000. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "That's more reasonable, but still not enough." His jaw tightened. "What's your counteroffer?" "The house. The lake house in Michigan. 70% of our liquid assets. And you report yourself to the Illinois Bar Association and the IRS." He laughed incredulously. "You can't be serious. That would end my career." "Actions have consequences, Ethan. So do threats," he snapped. "If you try to expose me, I'll claim you were complicit." "We filed joint tax returns, remember? You'll go down with me." I'd anticipated this response. The difference is, I have documented proof of my income sources. I have emails showing I questioned certain deductions that you assured me were legitimate. I have contemporaneous notes from conversations where you dismissed my concerns. The question is, what do you have to prove I knew about your financial crimes? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Ethan was a brilliant attorney, but he'd made a critical mistake in our marriage. He'd underestimated me. He'd handled all our financial and legal matters, believing I was content to let him manage that side of our life. He didn't realize I'd been paying attention, asking questions, keeping records, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because that's who I am. A financial analyst. Detail-oriented. Thorough. "I need time to think," he finally said. "Take all the time you need," I replied. "But understand this. At 5 p.m. today, if we don't have a signed agreement on my terms, the documentation goes to the managing partners at Wellington and Shaw, the Illinois Bar Association, and the IRS." He stared at me, seeing me, perhaps for the first time. "You'd really do that? After 12 years? 8 months, Ethan," I reminded him softly. "You threw away 12 years for 8 months with Rachel. And then you tried to leave me with nothing. So yes, I'd really do that." He left the house after that, probably to consult with his divorce attorney friend. I took the opportunity to execute the next phase of my plan. First, I called Sophia and updated her on the situation. She arranged for a settlement agreement to be drawn up according to my terms and messengered to Ethan's office by noon. Next, I made a series of financial moves I'd prepared for in advance. I transferred my portion of our joint accounts to my separate account. I contacted our investment manager and froze certain transactions on our portfolio. I changed the passwords on our shared cloud storage and email accounts. Most importantly, I finalized the sale of our lake house in Michigan, a sale I'd been quietly arranging for weeks. As a joint owner, I had the legal right to sell, though normally I would have needed Ethan's signature. However, 2 years earlier, Ethan had given me power of attorney to handle the property matters while he was tied up in a major case. He'd never revoked it, probably forgetting it existed. The sale had closed yesterday, with the proceeds going into a temporary escrow account I controlled. By 3 p.m., I hadn't heard from Ethan. I sent him a simple text. 2 hours remaining. At 4:15 p.m., he returned home, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. He stormed into the kitchen, where I sat calmly reviewing documents. "You sold the lake house?" he shouted, throwing papers onto the counter. "How the hell did you do that without my signature?" "Power of attorney," I replied calmly. "The one you gave me in 2020 for the property matters. You never revoked it." He ran his hands through his hair, looking wild-eyed and desperate. "This is insane. You can't do this." "I already have," I said. "The sale closed yesterday. The proceeds are in escrow, pending our divorce settlement. I've built everything we have." He exploded. "We built it together," I corrected him. "And you were planning to take it all from me. The only difference is, I'm better at this game than you expected." For a moment, I thought he might become physically aggressive. His fists clenched at his sides, his face contorted with rage. But Ethan had always been about control, about appearances. Physical violence would shatter his carefully constructed image. "The settlement agreement," I said, nodding toward the document package on the counter. Sophia drew it up. "You have," I checked my watch, 40 minutes to sign it. "Otherwise, the evidence goes out." "You vindictive bitch," he whispered. "No, Ethan, I'm a survivor. There's a difference." He grabbed the settlement papers and stormed into his home office, slamming the door. I heard things being thrown, glass breaking. I didn't move from my seat at the kitchen island. At 4:52 p.m., just 8 minutes before my deadline, Ethan emerged with the signed agreement. "I hope you're happy," he said bitterly, tossing the document in front of me. "You've destroyed everything." "No, you did that," I corrected him, checking that all the signatures were in place. "I just made sure I didn't go down with the ship." That night, Ethan packed a suitcase and left. I don't know where he went, probably to Rachel's, though I wondered how enthusiastic she'd be about hosting him now that he'd lost most of his assets and was facing potential professional ruin. I slept in our bed, my bed now, for the first time in weeks. And despite everything, despite the end of my marriage and the ugliness of the past month, I slept soundly. Because for the first time since discovering Ethan's betrayal, I felt in control of my future. The next morning, Ethan's world truly fell apart. While he'd signed a settlement to prevent me from exposing his financial crimes, I had made no promises about keeping quiet regarding the affair. At 9 a.m., I sent an email to the managing partners at Wellington and Shaw, expressing my concern about the relationship between Ethan and his assistant, including dates and times they'd met during business hours. By noon, Ethan was calling me, apoplectic with rage. The managing partners had called him in for an emergency meeting. Office relationships weren't strictly forbidden, but the firm had strict policies about disclosure and supervisory relationships. Ethan had violated both. "You promised not to expose me if I signed," he shouted over the phone. "I promised not to expose your financial crimes," I corrected him. "I said nothing about your affair." I hung up as he was still yelling. The following Monday, I received an email from the managing partner at Wellington and Shaw, thanking me for bringing the matter to their attention and informing me that appropriate action had been taken. I later learned that appropriate action meant Ethan had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. But the real blow came Tuesday morning. While reviewing the documentation I'd gathered about Ethan's affairs, one of the firm's internal auditors had discovered discrepancies in his billing records, exactly the kind of financial impropriety I'd uncovered. The administrative leave became a termination. The termination led to a referral to the Illinois Bar Association's Ethics Committee. Ethan's carefully constructed life was collapsing around him. And as each piece fell, I found myself not celebrating, but reflecting on how thoroughly I'd misjudged the man I'd married. That was 2 years ago. It's strange how quickly a life can transform, both his and mine. After the divorce was finalized, I sold the house in Evanston. Too many memories, too much negative energy. I bought a smaller but beautiful condo in downtown Chicago with a view of the lake. The proceeds from the house and lake house sales, combined with my portion of our investments, gave me significant financial security. Ethan's fall from grace was spectacular and swift. The Illinois Bar Association suspended his license pending a full ethics investigation. The IRS opened an audit of his finances going back 7 years. Wellington and Shaw distanced themselves completely, even issuing a public statement emphasizing that his actions were his alone and not reflective of the firm's practices. As for Rachel, she didn't stick around long. When the money and prestige evaporated, so did her interest in building a life with Ethan. Last I heard, she'd moved to Los Angeles and was working for a different law firm. I don't blame her, really. She was young, manipulated by someone in a position of power who had probably painted me as the cold, career-focused wife who neglected him. It's an old story. Sometimes, people ask if I regret how things played out, if I was too harsh, too calculating in my response to Ethan's betrayal. Maybe, but when I think about the alternative, being left with almost nothing after 12 years of partnership, watching him enjoy the fruits of our joint labor while I struggled to rebuild, I know I made the right choice for me. The strangest part was running into Ethan about 6 months ago. It was at a coffee shop downtown. He looked different, thinner, less polished. The expensive watch and tailored suit had been replaced with more modest attire. He's working as a legal consultant now, unable to practice law until his license suspension is reviewed next year. The IRS matter was settled with a substantial payment and penalties, but at least he avoided criminal charges. We spoke briefly, awkwardly. He asked how I was doing. I told him about my promotion to managing director at my firm, about the nonprofit board I joined that helps women achieve financial literacy and independence. You always were the smarter one, he said with a resigned smile. I should have remembered that. We both made mistakes, I said, surprising myself with the admission. Mine was thinking our marriage was something it wasn't. And mine was thinking I could find something better than what I had, he replied. For what it's worth, I'm sorry, Liv. Not just for the affair, but for how I handled everything after. I nodded, accepting his apology without offering forgiveness. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. But the acknowledgement was something. As we parted ways, he asked one final question. How did you know about the financial stuff? I mean, I thought I was careful. I smiled. I'm a financial analyst, Ethan. It's literally my job to spot inconsistencies and protect assets. You just never paid attention to what I actually do. That's the irony in all this. The skills I'd honed throughout my career, skills Ethan had often dismissed as less impressive than his legal prowess, were exactly what saved me when our marriage collapsed. These days, I'm doing more than just surviving. I'm thriving. The nonprofit work has been particularly fulfilling. I've helped dozens of women untangle their financial lives during divorce, teaching them to identify hidden assets and protect themselves from partners who would leave them vulnerable. I don't think about revenge anymore. I don't need to. Living well truly is the best revenge. But I do think about lessons, what I've learned, what I can teach others. The most important lesson? Information is power. Financial literacy is freedom. And no one, no matter how much you love them, should have complete control over your financial future. As for Ethan, I heard recently that he's dating again, someone age-appropriate this time. Someone I hope he values for more than her youth or appearance. Perhaps losing everything taught him what truly matters. Or perhaps not. Either way, it's no longer my concern. My life now belongs entirely to me. And that, more than any settlement or satisfaction from Ethan's downfall, is the true victory.